So the aim of this presentation is to explore the challenges revolving around future mobility in rural settings. And we're focusing on rural settings. Even though we're focusing on rural settings, we're not saying that there is necessarily a need to introduce connected autonomous vehicles in rural areas. But if they were to be introduced, then what are the challenges associated with that introduction? So we're also focusing on non-track-based road traffic, even though the future mobility agenda extends beyond that to include autonomous track-based modes. But yeah, we're focusing on rural settings and we're focusing on non-track-based modes when we're talking about future mobility during this presentation. So we're just going to tell you about the content and then we'll dive into the presentation. So firstly, we're going to explain what the future mobility agenda is and where it's heading overall. And then we're going to cover the UK's rural setting. So in order to understand how much of the UK is rural and what the impact of the future mobility on that area is. We're also going to discuss the political scene revolving around future mobility within the UK. And then we're finally going to talk about the challenges that we think future mobility needs to overcome in order to enable autonomous transportation in rural areas, if that is the direction the government wants to take. We've divided these challenges to 5 categories: structural, design-based, technical, financial, and social. So what is future mobility? Historically, a fundamental principle of road traffic has been that a driver needs to always be fully in control and responsible for the behavior of a vehicle in traffic. This principle refers to the Vienna Convention 1968 principles. However, recent technological advancement will enable the production of vehicles that no longer need to meet those requirements. A large part of the future mobility agenda focuses on substituting human-operated vehicles with autonomous vehicles, which connect and communicate with their surroundings in order to navigate the space. Saying that, last week there was an article that says that maybe autonomous vehicles might not be completely achievable using today's technology, but driverless vehicles will be possible. That means that even though there is not necessarily a driver, there will be someone in control at some level. But anyway, so that is the agenda of future mobility. And then the agenda was driven by the rising levels of congestion due to high levels of vehicle ownership. So the agenda is motivated by reducing the levels of congestions whilst increasing the mobility of people. This is where the future mobility agenda promises to increase mobility for groups which are currently being excluded from the transportation network, including the elderly, the very young, the economically marginalized, and the disabled. On practical grounds, in order for CAVs to operate, intelligent infrastructure is required, and an Internet of Things needs to be enabled to allow vehicles to communicate with their surroundings and other vehicles to receive real-time information, which means that in order to introduce autonomous vehicles, basically, it's not just that we need to introduce that technology, but what is associated with that technology, including infrastructure. And that's a particularly important point for rural settings, which we're going to elaborate more on during our challenges. So in relation to these requirements, there is certainly an urban-rural divide. In the UK in particular, internet connections and infrastructure quality starts to diminish the less urban the setting is. I mean, how many of us can relate to not having an internet connection while you're on a train, moving away from a city? And that is going to be more and more critical for future mobility, because they're all enabled by Internet of Things. So from this perspective, should we consider the autonomous agenda to be an exclusively urban vision, or is it a step towards blurring the line between urban and rural areas? And can we upgrade rural infrastructure and equip rural environments with an Internet of Things to enable autonomous readiness, or is that too big of an investment to make? But before we dive into the challenges, we need to explore the rural setting in the UK. According to the Ordnance Survey and governmental resources, approximately 93% of the UK is rural. In terms of population, almost a third of the UK population resides within rural or major rural areas. These maps depict the urban-rural divide, where rural is blue and urban is grey. So you can see most of the UK is blue. This means that if future mobility agenda continues to focus on urban settings only, approximately a third of the population will be excluded from this vision. And the population often is composed of the very groups that future mobility promises to benefit, for example, the elderly. We will cover that in more details in the 5 challenges section. But this is not to say that rural areas have been completely absent from the political agenda. In 2018, as you can see, the UK government spent £12.1 million to fund 6 CAV-related projects, 2 of which are related to testing in rural environments. By 2021, the UK government hopes to have completed a 30-year review of laws, a 3-year review of law to launch fully autonomous vehicles, and by 2022, the first fleet of CAVs will be launched in Milton Keynes. The future mobility timeline continues to predict that 2040, 95% of all new vehicles sold in the UK would be fully autonomous, and that figure hasn't been updated since it was published 3 years ago. However, there is no prediction as to what the rural-urban divide would be like, because most of the news come after trials in urban environments. But now we'll talk about the challenges, and I'll hand over to my colleague Fidel, who's going to talk more about these challenges.
Thank you, Janet. So, in rural areas, the transportation landscape is not fully prepared for the changes that accompany future mobility. So in order for future mobility to be eventually incorporated into these areas, the underlying issues must first be identified. So we have been able to identify 5 main challenges. The first being the structural challenge. So as most of us here know, by driving on these rural roads, there are a large number of potholes, cracks, and other structural defects, which already inconvenience drivers in the journeys. The second challenge is the design challenge. I'm not sure if anyone knows, but the DMRB, which is the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, does not actually apply to roads in these areas. This means that designers for these roads can design the roads to looser requirements, which could therefore result in poor quality of roads in areas that require a lot of maintenance, which require a lot of money to spend to keep them in a good state. The third challenge is the technical challenge. In most rural areas, the mapping detail is not extensive enough to suit emerging technologies such as cars and other future mobility technologies. This could pose a significant barrier to these new technologies in being used in these areas and could hinder them even being spread to rural areas. The fourth challenge is a cost challenge. So from the national budget, only 1% of this is allocated to local roads. Given that the rural roads make up to 80% of the UK road network, this is simply insufficient and they need to address this issue. The fifth challenge is the social challenge. Over half of the UK's population in rural areas is aged 45 and above. In England alone, 1 million of those aged 65 and above find it difficult to travel to hospitals and other local amenities due to lack of access and inconvenience and discomfort of public transport. So now that we know the challenges, we now have to look at how we can address them. So just move on to the next slide. So starting with the structural challenge, as mentioned before, the service conditions on these roads are horrible. I'm sure we've all experienced them in one way or the other, be it on country roads or in small towns and villages. That is not something that you want to experience. But by implementing many simple, direct, and minimalist improvements to the structural composition and maintenance of these roads, we are already paving a way for future mobility to come in and incorporate into the rural communities. New technologies have arisen that which you can incorporate into the surface of the roads that will monitor these roads so that when an issue is about to arise, it can then inform the local authorities. So that is before any cracks or potholes appear, they can warn the local authorities so that they can then come in and do what they need to do to prevent them even coming across on the road. And even with such technologies, there may be cases where, okay, a pothole may still appear, a crack may still appear. But when this happens, the local authorities need to speed up their response time so that these issues are fixed quickly, so that the inconvenience is minimal to all the people that use it. This includes damage to street furniture such as stop signs and speed signs, because when these are damaged, people may not know what speed limits are in those areas, and they may not know when to stop and when to start and when to wait for other cars to pass. So by fixing these, by improving the roads, you're therefore improving the safety in these areas, preventing more accidents in rural areas. Generally, but by maintaining roads in rural areas, you're not only benefiting future mobility, but you're also helping all road users, including cyclists, private vehicles, buses, taxis, and all of them. Moving on to the next challenge, the design challenge. So we believe that in order to support future mobility, there are three main components that will likely need to be that will be influenced in order to support future mobility, basically. The first component is the road geometry. Now, at the moment, the current lane and shoulder widths are designed for human drivers, and they're suited for their allowances. So where they may make mistakes, where they may, just swerve a bit, they're made for those. But given that future mobility vehicles will have computers that will carry out all the driving operation, there will be less need for these allowances, and the lane widths can be shorter. This means that you can even have more lanes on rural roads, improving the flow in these areas. Apart from that, the higher accuracy and efficiency of these computers will also mean that there'll be shorter stopping distances. So this means that even when it comes to giving allowances for lanes, you have less allowances because there'll be less time needed for the car to slow down before braking before reaching another vehicle. Lastly, the vegetation on these roads also needs to be considered, given that the proximity of vegetation at the moment may not necessarily affect the driver, but it could hinder a camera or a sensor, for example, being used from a cab to see how the road turns or bends ahead of the vehicle. The second component are the road markings. So at the moment, we know that they have the basic paint that is used for the lane markings and the hard shoulder markings. To support future mobility, you will need more advanced materials used for the markings. These will need to be more detectable, if you can say that by the vehicle. So markings that will not only appear in when there's good light, but also during extreme weather conditions, during low light conditions, the markings must still be visible to the vehicle. This could be via visible light, ultraviolet, or other ways, but it just needs to be more detectable by the vehicle's sensors or cameras so that even in these extreme conditions, they can still maneuver through the roads. The third component are the road signs and stripes. Given that, like I said before, cars will have specialized sensors and cameras, the speed signs and stop signs could be changed. Instead of them all being circular, they can each have a unique shape so that when the car's internal computer picks up that shape, it can then use block recognition to determine, okay, that on this road, I need to be at 50, I need to be at 40, and automatically adjust the speed for that road. Apart from that, in the future where there may not even be any specific signs, there may just be barcodes inside of the road, the vehicle could just scan the barcode and know that, okay, this is the speed for this road, and slow down or speed up where required. Now, this possibility of embedding into the computer, it raises the question of how much infrastructure can we embed into these future vehicles, into their mapping? And even that, by embedding these infrastructure into the vehicles, are we then shifting the risk or blame to the manufacturers from the local authorities? so that when something goes wrong, instead of having the manufacturer take on most of the blame or the risk for the road being bad, or even the driver, it then shifts from them all the way to the manufacturer for poor programming or poor manufacturing processes simply. So these are things that we need to consider before changes are made in the design aspects for rural roads. Now I'll hand over to my colleague Jeannie to finish off the presentation.
Thank you, Fidel. So we will continue to talk about the other types of challenges. So the first is or rather the third is actually the technical challenge. So the technology of autonomous vehicles is past its infancy and it's gradually moving into a phase of much progress and development. And in the UK, there are 6 government grants dedicated to AV research. And of the 6, 2 are centered around developing the necessary technology for rural application. So the first is a simulation testing study led by Horoba Mira, which involves various scenario testing and virtual actors. The aim of this study is to understand and to anticipate the situational encounters which are unique to rural environments and to develop the appropriate vehicular responses for CAVs. There are a couple of examples of such scenario testing, one being decision making of cabs on a single lane road. So in a rural setting, it is not uncommon to have narrow single lane traffic with passing places for vehicles. This normally wouldn't be an issue for drivers to decide among themselves, but the situation becomes rather different when 2 autonomous vehicles approach each other. The decision to allow either vehicle to have priority would have to be made by cabs and also should typically reflect a normal driver's response. The second is a research conducted by Dynium Robot. So this study involves developing cost-effective and fully autonomous tractors for local farmers. And the design environments for these tractors will be quite different compared to general traffic because elements such as uneven road surfaces or even the presence of livestock and animals, all these things need to be taken into consideration. Elsewhere in the States, researchers from MIT are also looking into developing a new mapping technology known as MapLight. And the concept of this essentially is to utilize only GPS and LiDAR only, so removing the dependence on extensive mapping data. The other bit, the cost challenge. So as said earlier, the rural areas make up 93% of the UK, and over a third of the population resides in these areas. However, the budget for transportation between rural and urban areas are massively disproportionate. According to a 2017 data on public spending, only 1% of the national budget is set aside for local roads. It is therefore unsurprising that we find rural roads are not well maintained, and as a result of that, as a result of these neglected roads, road accidents and injuries and fatalities are also more likely to happen, and therefore contributing to the overall cost in repair, compensation, and medical costs. So it's probably worth to start to think about the potential economic benefits of investing in roads for all road users, and this can be for users of traditional vehicles as well as autonomous vehicles. Other potential benefits can also come in the form of economic growth as a direct result of enhancing the transportation links between rural and urban areas. Time savings and roadside businesses which generates revenues can also be considered as potential economic benefits. Last but not least, the social challenge. So future mobility calls for the embracement of a new type of technology, one which depends on people's readiness for artificial intelligence. So in these rural areas, the level of uptake relies on the willingness of people to interact and accept these technologies. In these rural areas, the hope is that autonomous vehicles will provide assistance to those who have mobility difficulties. Such groups may be people with disabilities or the elderly population. Based on the graph shown, we can see that the elderly population aged between 70 and 80 are among the largest proportion of people using public transport at least once a week. And they are one of many groups of people who may benefit greatly from autonomous vehicles. However, when it comes to new technology, elderly population generally also encounter more barriers. So in order to better understand this, we look to a research conducted by the Heriot-Watt University's Department of Psychology. And through this study, a number of concerns have been reported by elderly population and their perception of technology. But the top 3 reported concerns were the lack of knowledge, feeling of inadequacies, and skepticism about technology. So there seems to be this feeling of unease when asked to interact with technology. And so in terms of the social challenge, we need to think about how the introduction of autonomous vehicles might be received by these groups and would benefit the most from it, and how we can ensure that the services that are put in place to serve these people who it is designed for. So a few examples we've come up with, which hopefully will make for a more inclusive design, is to ensure that the access to shared autonomous vehicles is done in a way that is more familiar to the elderly population. So this may include setting up an easy-to-use online service, which allows friends and families to call the service on behalf of them, a dial and ride scheme for CAF, or even a CAF stand if need be, one that is more familiar and user-friendly for elderly population. So in conclusion, I think we've looked at the rural setting in the UK and we broke that down to potential challenges one might encounter when trying to introduce autonomous vehicles in rural environments. We looked also at the physical infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, cost and social standpoint. And we continue to discuss how we might overcome these issues and what the areas which could do with some improvement, all of which takes into consideration factors which are unique to the rural environment and the community there. So I guess the thought process behind this presentation is about how introducing autonomous vehicles in rural parts of the UK is different compared to urban areas, and also to create a type of awareness of the potential barriers that are unique to rural communities. So thank you very much for dialing in, everyone, and we are happy to take any questions if you have them.
Hi, I just have a question.
Yes.
What kind of physical infrastructure do you think we will need to enable in our rural settings?
So for physical infrastructure, for infrastructure in general, other than internet, we do need to think about the physical infrastructure. As we mentioned, our challenges. So things would be like for autonomous vehicles, road markings, signs, and all of that. But again, we did pose the question that how much of it really needs to be physical, because if you can program the car to know destinations and origins and like to have an internal map, then possibly we can even code these signs and road markings and lane widths into that system, so the car would have all of the information at once. So we do think that there will definitely be some geometric changes, road markings and signs, but there is a possibility that the technological aspect of CAVs will be able to capture that. But one thing for sure is road surfacing, but that will not only benefit CAVs, it will also benefit existing cars or like existing type of technology. I hope that was clear. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, we're going to circulate this presentation. If anyone else has any questions afterwards, feel free to contact us. We also have this slide with the contact information. I'll hand over to you, Nadine. Yeah, and thank you for having us during this lunchtime.
Yeah, thank you very much, three of you. Very interesting presentation, and definitely a discussion, that's going to be with us for the next years and years. And it's good to have this insight from your perspective. So yeah, thank you very much.